Hello, and welcome to episode number 111 of the Point of Convergence podcast. As always, I am your host, ExoAcademian. Whenever we reach certain watershed moments within ufology, a whole new contingent of interested parties tend to enter the fray, after some new public revelation has convinced them that there really is a quote-unquote there after all. This happened en masse after a groundbreaking article was published in the New York Times in 2017. Another influx came after the Luis Elizondo and David Grusch revelations/allegations, respectively. One thing that each of these moments had in common, of course, is that they each had to do solely with the matter of UFOs and aliens, now rebranded UAP, unidentified anomalous phenomena, and NHI, non-human intelligence. In other words, the people tending to enter the conversation following these key inflection points really had no idea what a gateway drug, if you will, UFOs and aliens often end up proving to be. The gateway leads, of course, as all of you who've been on this journey with me for some time now know, to deeper matters having to do with not only who they are, these mysterious others, but who we are, and indeed to the nature of reality itself. That is to say, the high strangeness that is part and parcel of this phenomenon is, as they say, a feature, not a bug. Some have even ventured so far as to say that the phenomena themselves are manifesting as they do precisely to force us into new ways of thinking about all that's possible and all that is. Of course, for those looking with a keen eye, this venture into new models of reality is not confined to ufology. Yes, the bizarre, perplexing, and sometimes even absurd nature of the UFO phenomenon does lead people down some peculiar avenues in order to make sense of it all. But as it turns out, empirical research being done in distinct but converging fields of research, fields such as physics, astronomy, and neuroscience, is leading investigators in those fields into similar trains of thought. One notion that has arisen in light of the data that has been amassed by different researchers across these different fields of inquiry is that the quote-unquote physical reality we assume ourselves to be so comfortably placed within may not actually be so physical after all. In fact, what has emerged over time is surprisingly compelling evidence suggesting that our waking state realityscape may perhaps be better described as synthetic and derived from a deeper structure altogether. A simulation, you say? Well, sort of, but maybe not in the way you often hear described in popular discourse. But what is the nature of the evidence pointing in this direction? And if it's as compelling as seems to be the case, what are the implications, not just for the matter of UAP and NHI, but for us and for the context we find ourselves in, a context we've long taken for granted as settled, at least within Western civilization? These are precisely the matters we'll seek to explore in this, the 111th episode of the Point of Convergence podcast. As we begin this week's episode, I'd just like to remind everyone that if you would like to support this podcast and all of my work in general, and in so doing gain access to all of my content, which includes Point of Convergence, Liminal Frames, and Event Horizon, as well as OTC Squared, as well as the feature series I create, as well as the first 50 episodes of PoC now archived, as well as early access and discounts to my online courses and in-person retreats, you can do so by going to patreon.com/ExoAcademian or by subscribing on Spotify. All right, with that preamble aside, let's move on to today's topic. Now, this is a topic I've wanted to get to for some time, although I've held off while I've been gathering evidence. I've also held off to some degree because this notion has not been one I felt particularly warm towards. That is to say, it is not my first inclination to go in this direction. In fact, it's only a combination of empirical evidence, which I've been gathering over time, that persuades me this is likely, as well as a personal experience I've had. In fact, several personal experiences. These experiences, and especially the most recent one, which I'll describe in a minute, really hit home on the notion that this reality, the waking state reality we find ourselves in most of the time, is actually illusory. And I don't just mean in a sense of conceptually illusory in the way that Eastern traditions talk about, where people can kind of entertain the idea, but I mean a direct revelation, a direct gnosis, a knowing that this is not real. This is actually more like a construct. That's a word I like to use because it's not too loaded. Some people might say simulation. We'll get into the different nuances of that term and why it sometimes works and sometimes doesn't. And there's sometimes these implicit assumptions involved in that. So we'll get into that. But it definitely feels synthetic, let's say that. I'll also help define that a little bit later. So these experiences, and especially the most recent one, the most impacting aspect of it was coming back here and having a direct knowing, not a hunch, not a supposition, but a direct knowing that this is not real. I walked around for hours afterwards with that revelation, and it helped to recontextualize how I want to live the rest of my life. As I've talked about on other podcasts, Liminal Frames and Event Horizon, it was a bit like understanding we were living in a kind of dreamscape, but it's more than just that. I'll get into that because there's ways you can measure the nature of the realityscape we're in. And I also found it useful to think about this like a story. Consensus reality as we conceive of it is really a story we are living into. And there are implications that play out in what looks like evidentiary ways based on the plot of the story, which is decided at some higher fractal layer of which we also play a part in, of course. But usually people are only in touch with this part of themselves, kind of refracted into this reality, which again is more like a dreamscape. It's definitely illusory. It's purposeful. It's meaningful, but it's not ultimately real. And as I've said on different podcasts over time, I think that should invite us to take it seriously, but not take it literally. And that frees us up to be more creative while also letting go of the fears that once we lose ourselves here, there's nothing to us. This is simply not true because this particular refraction, this iteration of us, this avatar we are inhabiting is just that, an avatar. It's not the ultimate user that's behind the experience. That's us at a different fractal layer. But I'll get into that later because I don't want to digress into that as a side point. But let me just put it this way before we move on. When we talk about our consciousness being non-local, I don't mean, and I don't think many of us who are thinking about this in these terms mean non-local, but somewhere else in the physical universe. No, it's that our consciousness is outside space-time altogether. And again, I would suggest you can use the analogy of a video game. You are inhabiting the avatar moving around the screen. But of course, that doesn't mean that your actual consciousness is somewhere else in a different level of that video game. It means that actually your consciousness is outside that construct altogether. So again, just to quickly reiterate, the experience I had on Christmas Day made that point abundantly clear. There was nothing more clear than that after that experience. It's hard to describe how exactly it was so clear. It was just a direct knowing. It was as deep as any other thing I hold to be fully trustworthy. This realityscape is illusory. It's not ultimately real. And because of that, I can be more flexible, creative, and playful in how I want to live the remaining time, which again is just one of the constraints of the video game, if you will, while I'm here. All right, that was my personal experience, which again was a kind of climax on a series of experiences I had that were leading to this revelation. So even there, I definitely recognized a synchronistic orchestration that I've talked about before, which is coming from outside of the construct. All right, that was my personal experience. Now we want to begin to dive into the empirical evidence gathered elsewhere that also supports this notion that this reality is synthetic, if you will, kind of like a simulation, although again, there are certain assumptions behind how people tend to conceive of that, and I want to unpack some of that. But definitely there is empirical evidence pointing in this direction that this is certainly not base reality, and that actually we see signs that this is being projected from some deeper structure of reality. That's what we want to get into next. In the introduction, I mentioned that UFOs and NHI tend to be a gateway drug of sorts that leads people into deeper questions around the nature of reality. And this brings to mind something I wrote on social media this past week. I said, quote, "To ask if the craft and beings that are part of the phenomenon are quote unquote physical, i.e. not phantasms or delusions, is understandable. But beneath that mainstream question lies a deeper mystery, where even physics points to reality being derived from beyond space-time altogether. So this is the key here. As you begin to investigate what seems like the cherry on top of our physical notion of reality, that is to say, UFOs and NHI, perhaps coming from some distant star system, the evidence you find inevitably, if you're looking at it honestly and plainly, dives into deeper matters having to do with the nature of reality itself. Now, in today's episode, we'll be referencing a book titled The Simulated Multiverse. An MIT computer scientist explores parallel universes, the simulation hypothesis, quantum computing, and the Mandela effect. And this was written by Riz Verk. He also wrote a book called The Simulation Hypothesis, which was very well received and had quite an impact. This book is sort of the sequel to that, expanding the notions even further into the notion of a multiverse. Excellent book. I highly recommend it. And I had a chance to meet Riz when I was in Houston a couple of years ago. And we had a brief conversation at the time. That was before I had read this book. And I think this book particularly is an excellent contribution to the matters at hand. Now, I've mentioned already that this has to do with simulations, of course. And again, Riz's first book was titled The Simulation Hypothesis, where he takes it on headlong. Now, the issue is some people have certain assumptions baked into this notion of the simulation hypothesis. I want to unpack some of that. But again, it comes down to this notion that this reality we experience in our daily waking experience is not ultimately real. And that's why it's kind of like a simulation. We'll get into how that's the case. Bottom line, it's not base reality. So let's talk about a few different notions of simulation so we can sort of hone in on which one feels the most accurate, at least from my point of view. First, you have a notion of a nested simulation. If our reality is a simulation, the entity or system creating it could reside in a quote-unquote real universe. This real universe might itself be a simulation, but the chain must terminate in some base reality to avoid an infinite regress. Now, this is what I'm talking about. Most people, when they think about the simulation hypothesis, assume this might be like a video game. It might be digital in some way, but it's being derived from some context that is real, that is physical, that basically we are a program being run in the real reality, perhaps run by aliens, but that they exist in a physical reality. I don't think that's true. And again, I think that's another assumption tied to physicalism, which we've already established many, many times on this podcast, on my other podcasts, is simply not tenable. None of the evidence supports it basically at this point. And yet it's still the common notion in our mainstream society and even within much of academia. So people assume that if this is a simulation, it must be arising from some actual real reality, which is physical. And that's not what I think is going on here because, again, I don't think there is such a thing as a physical reality. We next have to consider the notion of purposeful design. Because if the simulation was created intentionally, example for research, entertainment, or experimentation, it implies the existence of a designer and a reality in which the designer exists. This again points to a notion within Christian kind of thinking, monotheistic traditions, and has to do with this notion of a designer. Some of you in those circles may be familiar with the notion of intelligent design. That's basically what this is speaking to, and you can actually draw that argument from the evidence we're going to discuss today. And that's why even some atheists, some scientists, some computer programmers have said that this is probably the best evidence they've seen for God since they first considered the notion. Next, there's the notion of a simulation as being self-contained. So the simulation may not be based on anything real, quote unquote, but instead may be entirely self-contained. Therefore, the rules, the objects, the entities within it could be wholly synthetic, not referencing or mimicking any external reality. This is closer to what I point to. It's synthetic in the sense that it's not actually base reality, but neither is it trying to mirror or mimic or replicate something that is quote unquote real and quote unquote physical. Next, we have the notion of reality as a construct. If what we call quote-unquote real is itself a subjective experience or construct, then the distinction between simulated and real becomes meaningless. The simulation may simply be another layer of experience without requiring an external grounding. Again, I think there's something to this, and if you adopt a notion like idealism to make sense of the world, then this last point would make a lot of sense to you. All we have is conscious experience, different layers of that, and therefore it's always subjective. There is nothing outside of that. But these two notions that I just described get at how I'm conceiving of this. The bottom line, though, is that we can see evidence in this reality, in this construct, in our most immediate surroundings, suggesting that not only is this not real, but we see signs of the synthetic nature. And before long, we're going to get into the evidence, which is pretty compelling, pointing in those directions. But before we go there, I first want to tie this into other Eastern ancient traditions and how this very much dovetails with those notions. Because, for instance, you have the notion of Maya, illusion, the notion that this waking state reality is absolutely illusory, a kind of playground, and that we would do well to recognize it for what it is, not take it seriously as if it's the ultimate reality, base reality, and only when we have that perspective will we intelligently and creatively find flow in this state and understand its ultimate purpose, which is to mature consciousness, which very much dovetails with what I've said many times, which is that this particular context is a stage set for the evolution of consciousness. Now, Riz touches on this in his book, The Simulated Multiverse, and I want to get into that section now. He says, quote, "When matching the simulation hypothesis to the Hindu and Buddhist concepts of illusion and reincarnation, one barely needs to draw an analogy or speak in metaphor. The ancient texts were clearly using older metaphors. One of their core tenets is that the world around us is Maya, a Sanskrit term that roughly translates to illusion, or with more nuance, a carefully crafted illusion. We are led to think it is real, it feels real, but it is in fact illusory, made only of light. Another metaphor often invoked in Buddhism is the idea that the world is like a dream. The Hindu Vedas, the oldest written scriptures of a major religion, speak of Leela, or the grand play of the gods, as if we were participating in a stage play as actors, a metaphor picked up by Shakespeare in the Middle Ages when he wrote, "All the world's a stage, and all the men and women merely players." Coming forward to the past century, in the book Autobiography of a Yoga, we learned that the world is like a moving picture seen on a screen at a movie theater. Everything is a carefully crafted illusion, and we get so caught up in it that we forget there is a beam of light from the projector to the screen that is giving us the illusion of motion. This is a good metaphor because there is no such thing as motion in a motion picture. It is just a carefully crafted illusion. If Yogananda or the rishis, shadowy figures in history who wrote the Vedas, or even Shakespeare were alive today, I believe that they would use a more up-to-date metaphor, one that combines a stage play or film with free will, scripts that can change based on choices made by individual players. Basically, they would say that we are living in an interactive video game. And in this video game, we can imagine the historical Buddha, for instance, saying something like, quote, "Know that all phenomena are like reflections appearing in a very clear mirror, devoid of inherent existence." To those of us in the simulation, anyone outside of the simulation would seem like supernatural beings, perhaps God or gods or devils, a trend echoed by Philip K. Dick in his speech at Metz, where he used the terminology of a programmer and counter-programmer. Watching the full speech and his other writings, you can see these terms are obviously religiously loaded. Even Bostrom mentions a naturalistic theogony in his original paper, pointing out that the creators of the simulation would seem like supernatural beings or gods to us because they would effectively be omniscient, unquote. So this was pretty well described here. You see lots of parallel here between the notion of a simulation and Maya, or illusion, or a carefully nuanced illusion that is crafted to seem real. This is essential here. Now, what's also interesting, though, as a notion is that perhaps we are supposed to have skin in the game, as I've described before, using that kind of metaphor. In other words, it should feel real. We have to believe this is base reality, all that is, so that we will take it seriously and have the resistance training that allows us to work with the energetic configurations that arise through the events of our lives and learn to be more adept in working with that energy. But perhaps in the midst of that, in the long scope of history, there was this understanding that there would be clues left behind, breadcrumbs along the trail, if you will, that eventually would lead a civilization to understanding that this is illusory. They would recognize themselves as characters within a play, characters of which the storyline, the plot points, have been developed from perhaps higher fractal versions of themselves, which might exist outside the construct. Again, these are non-local, completely non-local, outside the construct altogether. That's what would happen if we do this exterior kind of search. And this brings to mind what I brought up on the most recent Liminal Frames episode. You have exoteric kind of research or understanding or teaching that is what this is. Through research, empirical research, we come to find that there are signs that this reality is actually synthetic, not actually real, meant to appear so and feel so, but not ultimately real. And in the same way, through esoteric traditions, you can do this interior journey, which leads to the same revelation, the very same revelation. So you can go outward or inward, and either way you come to the same conclusion. And that's why these ancient religious traditions, ancient wisdom traditions came to the same notion because of the extensive interior research they were conducting at that time. So it's really, really fascinating when we think about the fact that not only is this meant to be convincing, but there's also exits. There are ways that we can learn about this illusory nature and perhaps reach a new point, a new epoch in human civilization where we respond as a collective to this fundamental shift in our understanding of who we are and what this is. Now, a few moments ago, I mentioned Philip K. Dick. He plays a key role in this conversation historically because not only did he write stories that really point to these kinds of notions, The Adjustment Bureau being a movie that was made out of one of his films, for instance, but beyond that, because we know that these stories were based on memories he actually had. In other words, he actually remembered alternate versions of history, not as interesting ideas to explore in terms of plot lines, but he literally remembered them. And this made him really wrestle with the nature of reality. And this relates to how he thought about things like Mandela effect. This is a quote that was made by Philip K. Dick. He said, quote, "We are living in a computer-programmed reality, and the only clue we have to it is when some variable is changed and some alteration in our reality occurs," unquote. Of course, here we think of The Matrix, which is more like a modern-day version of a Philip K. Dick kind of plot, where Neo notices the black cat twice, and that's a sign of a glitch where something has changed in the Matrix. Some sort of update has happened, which creates a momentary glitch, which if you're paying close attention, you will recognize the implication of that. Now, Nick Bostrom is someone else who has talked about and explored this notion of us living in a computer simulation. Now, a few moments ago, I wanted to distinguish this from being a simulation in terms of being based on some real physical reality. But what we also see here is this notion of a computer simulation. That might rub some people wrong, and to be honest, it kind of rubbed me wrong initially as well, because computers are a modern invention of humanity. Aren't we being anthropocentric to assume that this is somehow what's behind the nature of this simulation? I can understand that concern, but we're going to get into some of the data itself, some of the research that's been done, and some of that does point to a digital-like kind of structure here. So we'll get to that. But I now want to quote another section from this book where we hear about Bostrom's exploration of this notion of us living in a simulation. From the book, quote, "It wasn't until Swedish philosopher Nick Bostrom, now professor of philosophy at Oxford, wrote his landmark paper, Are You Living in a Computer Simulation?, that the idea moved beyond science fiction and the terminology we use today of the simulation hypothesis started to catch on. Bostrom starts his now famous paper with, many works of science fiction as well as some forecasts by serious technologists and futurologists predict the enormous amounts of computing power that will be available in the future. Let us suppose for a moment that these predictions are correct. One thing that later generations might do with their super powerful computers is run detailed simulations of their forebears, or of people like their forebears. Bostrom's argument was about a particular kind of simulation, which he calls ancestor simulations, and uses it to make his argument. Let's add this to our growing list of definitions. Ancestor simulation. Introduced by Nick Bostrom, this refers to a kind of simulation run by an advanced technological society that decides to run simulations on their ancestors. For example, in our own world, this would be as if we were creating a fully immersive sim that took place in ancient Rome, or if it happened 1,000 years from now, our descendants might be simulating us, that is, their 21st century ancestors. Bostrom goes on to say that computational power may not be limited on cosmic timescales, and that it is possible for technologically advanced civilizations to devote an entire planet's worth of resources towards computing, estimating that would provide more than enough computing power to simulate a whole universe and the people in it. Bostrom presents his conclusion early on in the abstract, and you can read the paper to get the details. It could be the case that the vast majority of minds like ours do not belong to the original race, but rather to people simulated by the advanced descendants of an original race. It is then possible to argue that, if this were the case, we would be rational to think that we are likely among the simulated minds rather than among the original biological ones. The rest of the paper goes into details of how he arrived at this conclusion, which requires at least one civilization to arrive at what he calls post-human, which is analogous to what I call the simulation point, when a technological civilization can build simulations that are so sophisticated they cannot be distinguished from physical reality, unquote. Now again, catch the last sentence there, cannot be distinguished from physical reality. So again, here with Nick Bostrom, we still have a physicalist notion that there's a base reality somewhere that is physical, and that he's surmising that perhaps a really advanced civilization would want to create sims of their ancestors, and we might be that. In fact, he goes on to make the argument that there might be many more sim universes than there are actual physical ones. So we are more likely to be in a simulated universe than a physical one. But again, that relies on the notion of physicalism and a physical universe, which I think is a non-starter to begin with. But still fascinating to look back at how our society began to wrestle with this notion, not just in these ancient traditions that did, again, this interior research, but also how some of our scientists, our futurologists, our technologists began to play with this possibility as our own technology began to point in the direction of this being ultimately possible one day once we had enough computing power. The notion being that basically every aspect of reality is just information. So if you had enough information and enough computing power, you could render in 3D, 4D if you will, if you want to insert time as one of the variables. You could use all of that information to project a simulation from physical reality, and the beings inside of it would basically just be simulations themselves, part of this overarching simulation, this computer simulation. Again, I don't think that's what's going on. I don't think this is originated from a future civilization like ours or some other alien race. I think it's outside of physicality, because I don't think physicality is a thing to begin with any more than the physicality you experience or work with inside a video game is ultimately real. In other words, the apparent physicality is just part of the immersive nature of the construct, and we are confusing the two. All right, so thus far I've talked about my experience and experiences, plural, that lead me in this direction. We've also talked about how the ancient wisdom traditions landed here from their own interior research. And we've also talked about how technologists, philosophers, different kinds of modern thinkers have also leaned in this direction. Now let's get to what I promised, which is some of the compelling empirical evidence suggesting that this is actually synthetic in nature, not ultimately real. So the idea that our reality could be a digital simulation is rooted in both philosophical inquiry and computational concepts. If our reality were specifically a digital simulation, certain clues or characteristics might delineate it from other possible constructs. All right, so let's get to some aspects of this evidence. First of all, let's discuss the quantization of reality. So here we have the notion of discrete units. And evidence of space, time, or energy being fundamentally quantized, in other words, existing in discrete packets, could hint at a pixelation of reality, if you will, akin to the resolution issues you run into in a digital simulation. Now, here we think about the notion of Planck scale. The Planck length, for instance, which is the smallest measurable length, and Planck time might represent the grid size or the clock cycle of the simulation. In other words, when we've tried to investigate the building blocks of reality, we come to these points where we cannot reduce any further, almost like that is the pixel level, that there are constraints in how far we can measure, and this suggests in itself that it's just enough to render something that seems real, but that it's ultimately not real, and that we run into the constraints at the outer edges here when we try to measure. And people like Donald Hoffman have also pointed to that in his argument that consciousness is fundamental, not physicality. Next, we have the notion of errors, glitches, or anomalies. We touched on that a little bit earlier with the work of Philip K. Dick and the Matrix. Now, here we have consistency failures that we might notice. So observations of inconsistencies in physical laws or phenomena. An example would be unexplainable anomalies in physics experiments. We might also notice reality hiccups, if you will, which could be things like déjà vu, Mandela effects, or inexplicable synchronicities that might reflect code errors, if you will, or overlaps in the simulation. And of course, we do indeed find those kinds of things. People do experience déjà vu. People have pointed to the Mandela effect, this really bizarre situation where people remember en masse a history that no longer seems to be represented in the historical record, suggesting that something's happened, some sort of update has happened. And we'll get into a little bit later how that might happen and why that might happen. Another notion to explore here is artificial constraints. We touched on that a little bit, but let's go into a bit more detail here. So we might notice limits on complexity. Artificial constraints in nature, such as maximum speed, the speed of light, might suggest computational limitations. We also think about simulation boundaries, so unexpected phenomena occurring at extreme edges of observable reality. Example, at the cosmological horizons or black holes could indicate boundaries of the simulation. So in previous podcasts, I've talked about how one of the difficulties in science and astronomy was trying to reconcile how you have a black hole that at first blush seems to swallow everything. And this violates the law of conservation because this information was apparently lost forever, which didn't fit with our understanding of the universe. Again, it might be the laws of the construct, not the actual universe. But what was later realized was that in 2D form around the edge of the black hole, you could store all the information so that from that you could boot up the 3D experience from that information. In other words, all of the information necessary was still there. And that itself is kind of a hint because we find that we can store information in 2D form that is comprehensive enough to boot up the 3D experience. Now, what's even more interesting is that not only did we realize that black holes function like this, but when we looked at the entirety of the cosmos as we conceive of it, and as we've been able to understand it so far, it looks like the entire cosmos might actually be what exists inside a black hole, and that we might be projections from the edge of the black hole, that we are experiencing a 3D reality, which might actually be a holographic representation which is projected from the edges of the cosmos stored in this 2D form. Another clue that might point to this notion of this being a construct is the apparently very precise mathematical structures of our reality. So we have notions like universal algorithms. If the universe operates entirely according to algorithms, such as, for instance, fractals and cellular automata, then this could imply it is governed by a digital computational framework. Another notion to consider here is emergent phenomena, evidence of complexity arising from simple rules, like in Conway's Game of Life, could suggest underlying code-like structures. In other words, there are certain base conditions that are populated, and then when you run the sim, when you actually execute the code, emergent complexity seems to arise as a result. And very importantly, what this means is that only by running the simulation can you get to the emergent complexity. You can't get there by just doing some mathematical equations. You actually have to run the simulation, let all the variables play together, and in a kind of chaos theory kind of mechanism, you end up with emergent complexity. So that plays really well with the notion that source consciousness wants to explore every possible permutation of every possible reality down to the most minute detail changing. And so what this allows you to do is exactly that. You set up the initial conditions and then you run through every possibility. And by the way, this very much fits with another experience I've had in my past, several actually, in terms of anomalous experiences, where I perceived what seemed to be a relentless iterating of realities, one after another, in all these different fractal patterns. That very much fits with the notion that source consciousness is exploring all the possibilities, all the ways that the formless can be expressed in myriad forms in every possible configuration. All right, the next kind of evidence to consider is evidence of encoding. Here we first think of binary structures. So this would involve detection of binary or error-correcting codes embedded in fundamental laws of physics, as hypothesized by some physicists like James Gates. Next, we have the notion of information conservation. So theoretical constraints where information is conserved. For example, in the holographic principles we already discussed, this might point to a digital substrate. Then we have computational limits in nature. So first, the notion of finite resources. If the universe behaves as though it has finite memory or processing power, then this could hint at a digital simulation. We should also consider entropy and data processing. The universe's tendency toward increasing entropy could parallel computational energy dissipation or resource allocation. So again, mirroring here these digital structures that we find in what we're creating, we're seeing evidence of the same kinds of things showing up as we try to measure the outer limits of our reality. All right, the next evidence to consider is outside interference. Do we see signs of this? This could involve, for instance, unexplainable modifications, events that appear to, quote-unquote, break the rules, such as highly specific divine interventions or UFO phenomena. This all comes back again to UFOs and NHI. Their presence points to this kind of nature of reality. This could represent interference by, quote-unquote, external programmers or users. Again, think about high strangeness. It might be highly strange to us, but that's only because we're seeing parameters that seem to violate the rule set. But if you're coming from outside the game, you don't have to adhere to that rule set. We also think of observer-dependent phenomena. So the role of consciousness in quantum mechanics, example of course is the observer effect, could suggest interaction with a computational observer mechanism. In other words, code only runs, only executes when there's a user interacting with it. Just like your video games don't run when you're not there. When you come home and start up the game, that's when the code executes. When you go from one screen to another, one level to another, new functions run only as they are needed. And it's done this way, of course, so as to conserve energy and resources. And this brings us to a notion of simulating the simulation. In other words, as we've explored reality and we've developed as a civilization, improved our technology, we may now perhaps be stumbling across the same principles that underlie the very reality we think we exist within. So here we have the notion of simulating the simulated. If we can replicate aspects of reality using computer simulations that mirror natural laws, that may suggest our own reality could also be a higher level simulation. So really fascinating, different kinds of empirical research, data that is pointing in these directions already. Something I already touched on that we should expound upon as well is the notion of fractals. These, of course, are repeating patterns that appear at different scales throughout our reality. This is fascinating, and there's no real reason this should be the case unless you're rolling out a construct, a simulation of sorts, a synthetic reality of sorts that is meant to conserve resources. So rather than having to use myriad different kinds of structures over and over again, you instead use certain patterns and repeat them at scale. And initially, it's hard to notice those things. Again, the beings within the construct, the players within the video game might not notice at first. But as we've gotten better with our technological prowess and we've been able to study more quantum layers of reality, we are learning that these structures, these patterns, repeat over and over and over again. So for instance, the inner structure of a leaf mirrors the structure of a human lung, and the neurology of a human brain seems to mirror the cosmos at its most expansive scale. So we see these patterns over and over again. And again, when a computer programmer such as myself, that is part of my background was being a software engineer, looks at that, we can't help but think of the fact that we also had those considerations and those constraints we adhere to in order to conserve resources. And here we get to a point that really is more easily understood by programmers because we've had these concepts, these principles drilled into us. For instance, one notion that every programmer runs into, and a very new programmer, a fresh programmer, might not understand these principles, and they are called on it, and over time they begin to program differently in a more mature way so as to optimize for these principles. For instance, one notion that is taught to programmers right away is called DRY, and that stands for don't repeat yourself. In other words, don't write the same code in multiple places. Instead, write the code once and just reference that code from somewhere else when you need to use it. That means you write fewer lines of code, you're saving memory and resources. Again, you could say we see evidence of those very same principles being applied to our quote-unquote reality. And now I'd like to touch on something we've already discussed in passing, but we should go into more detail here because it plays in here. And this is the notion of the Mandela effect. So I've discussed this on other podcasts to some degree on liminal frames. We went into it in more detail on Event Horizon. Now here we have the notion of quantum cloning and the multiverse. This is something Riz gets into in his book, and I think this is a fascinating notion to explore, to explain why we notice the Mandela effect. So this is again a section from Riz's book where he discusses quantum cloning and the multiverse. Quote, you may have seen recent news reports that particles were teleported from one location to another using a process of quantum teleportation. This sounds quite esoteric, kind of like the teleporters that are used on Star Trek to send Captain Kirk and Mr. Spock to the surface of a planet instantaneously from the Enterprise, which usually stays in orbit. Quantum teleportation relies on a type of entanglement and doesn't actually clone a particle, or even for that matter, teleport a particle. What it does is clone, and if you like, teleport the information that is contained in a particle. Whereas we can clone the information in a particle by using quantum entanglement with another particle, there is nothing that produces new particles that are exactly the same as the old particle per se. Rather, it is like applying the information from one part of the video game to pixels in another part of the simulated universe. Nothing in nature clones large objects instantaneously. As we are discovering, even genetic clones of living things have to be grown from single cells and take some time. Biological reproduction takes 9 months to create a new mini-clone of a human, a baby, and even that's not a perfect clone. In general, creating physical things requires some amount of processing time because nature relies on algorithms. In the many worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics, you're not just cloning things once or twice, you are cloning the entire universe every single time there is a quantum decision. That means you are cloning on the order of 1,080 particles every single nanosecond, or whatever the interval is between quantum measurements. Further complicating things, do these multiple worlds have persistence? In other words, if there are two possible measurements of a particle, does each world branch off and continue to exist ad infinitum? Or does it, with the next measurement of a particle, merge with some other universe that previously had differences? Do some of the universes disappear if nothing interesting is going on? Or do they always grow towards infinity? Although there seem to be massive challenges with cloning physical things, we don't need a long process to clone information. In fact, this is where Wheeler's later insight that the universe consists of information, it from bit, so to speak, seems to tie surprisingly in with the simulation hypothesis and to the quantum multiverse. It is much easier to think of cloning the information of a universe than it is to think of cloning the actual universe. This is yet another example of information theory seeping into physics. The conservation of energy principle, one of the bedrocks in physics, has been augmented by the conservation of information principle in the newly emerging field of digital physics." Unquote. And now we're going to jump to a section where he talks about the implications of this if there were something, someone outside the construct that's trying to learn things by executing these different iterations of a cosmic construct. Jumping back into the book, quote, "One suggested solution is that someone or something, a designer, tuned the variables in setting up the initial conditions, and then like a computer simulation that proceeds with deterministic rules, our universe was allowed to evolve to the current point. Even if the initial conditions were varied randomly across multiple simulations, only those that produced life might be interesting to the simulators, and the others might be shut down. Thus, we have at least one mechanism in a simulated multiverse for pruning that is consistent with how we run simulations." Unquote. So this is where a notion like the Mandela effect, which we've already discussed, comes into play. Because the notion here is that you would run different iterations of the construct, and once you've resolved something you were looking to explore, you would merge those back together. So this, again, very much dovetails with computer programming. Because when we have certain code that's being executed and run in production, as the expression goes, you don't want to mess with that code because you might break the game, the app, or whatever is actually relying on that code, which has been proven to work well. But say you want to develop a new feature, then what you do is you branch off a version of that code and you add your feature to that branch, is what it's called. You test it, make sure it works and doesn't break the underlying code. And then you merge that new feature, once you're sure it's safe, back into what's called the master branch, so that you now have a new feature running in production and you don't have to worry about it breaking the code. So that's a bit of a crude analogy, but it kind of applies here. So the notion is that when we experience something like the Mandela effect, this apparent incongruency between our memory of the past and the way the past is actually now recorded, what this may be evidence of is where a different branch was merged in with the branch we were originally on, and that changed something, and we, in our consciousness, which is not just limited to the game space, but actually exists, again, outside the construct, is able to recognize that shift. It's very peculiar to us. We don't know what to make of it because we assume there's one reality proceeding in a linear fashion. But what this points to is actually the branching and then remerging of two different branches, which changes history. But for us who are conscious agents who are only partly within the construct, but again, also exist outside the construct, we recognize the incongruency, and that sends us on this path to try to understand what has happened. And again, that might be another breadcrumb left along the trail, deliberately perhaps, so that at one point we begin to put two and two together and recognize that this is a synthetic construct of sorts that's meaningful, that is testing this exploration of conscious agents working in different configurations, but ultimately is derived from some deeper reality. Perhaps after hearing these different notions being bandied about, you might wonder, is there a way we could test this, actually prove to some degree of certainty that this actually is a simulation, a synthetic reality, a construct? Well, as it turns out, someone named Tom Campbell, which many of you might be familiar with, is pursuing exactly this. He's trying to find evidence for this notion that this is a virtual reality of sorts. So I want to again quote a section from Riz's book. Quote, "Ever wondered if reality is just an elaborate simulation? Former NASA physicist Tom Campbell has dedicated his work to answering that mind-bending question. Through his nonprofit, Campbell has designed a series of experiments to test whether our universe is being quote-unquote rendered, much like a video game. His approach offers a fresh spin on the famous double-slit experiment, which explores the wave-particle duality of light and matter. Campbell's hypothesis suggests that without an observer or a player, the recorded information about the universe never actually exists. This aligns with the idea of a participatory universe, where reality is only created when someone interacts with it, much like how objects in a video game pop into existence as you move through the environment. While the simulation hypothesis is not new, Campbell's scientific background and unconventional experiments make his exploration of this theory especially compelling. Could our world really just be pixels in a cosmic game? Campbell's experiments might get us one step closer to the truth, unquote. By the way, if you're interested in learning more about that, you can go to www.cusac.org, and that gets into the experiments that Campbell is conducting. Now, just for those who may not be familiar, Tom Campbell actually is someone who was way back in the day employed by Bob Monroe when Bob Monroe was trying to explore out-of-body experiences and trying to determine if we could find empirical evidence suggesting people really do, quote unquote, go somewhere with out-of-body experiences. He was hoping both to find that evidence and also to streamline the process by which people can induce out-of-body experiences, which is still carried on today by the Monroe Institute, named in his honor, which I've been to before, attended a private retreat I've discussed on different podcasts before. So initially, Tom Campbell was a physicist with no interest in these matters whatsoever, a straight-ahead, nuts and bolts kind of physicist. He was hired by Bob Monroe to basically document things and to bring his physics background to make sure everything was above board and scientifically accurate so that the results would be compelling to a scientific audience, a mainstream audience, not just people into the quote-unquote woo. But as it turns out, not only did Tom Campbell do that, but in the evenings and overnight, he would begin to experiment with out-of-body experiences himself. And to his surprise, he found he was very good at it. He could induce them very easily. And then with his physics understanding as a scientist, he decided to explore these other realms to see what he could determine about the nature of reality, building a much more robust understanding of reality, where he's able to experiment and measure and draw evidence from not just this reality construct, but another one as well. And what he determined, and this is discussed at length in his book, My Big Toe, which is actually a series of books, you can see the fullness of his theory as it's described. But basically what he gets to is that this is a virtual reality amongst many different kinds of virtual realities, and that each of these is run to reduce entropy, just like we try to reduce entropy in a computing system. And in this sense, for us, whenever we experience love and unite together around a kind of unit of experience, recognizing that we are source consciousness, something I've discussed many, many times on this podcast, then in so doing, we reduce entropy in the system. Distortion is cleaned out, which very much fits with what I teach in Essence of Being, of course, that there's this clear, undistorted field of undifferentiated consciousness, but in the myriad forms that are expressed in the simulations, in the constructs, we have to work out through trial and error how to remember what we actually are at a deeper level. And as we do that and achieve unit of experience, that reduces distortion or entropy in the field, which in turn is fed up the chain, if you will, up the fractal hierarchy, if you will, so that source itself learns from the experience, which again, very much fits with what I described in terms of what is the purpose of the endeavor? What is going on here? Why would these many, many different constructs exist to begin with? It has to do with source consciousness pouring itself out from the formless into myriad forms so that it can explore itself, understand itself through the emergent complexity that arises only when you actually execute a construct, when you actually take this simulated reality, this synthetic reality, and let the different conscious agents interact and see what arises as a result. That's what's at play here, and that's a key word, by the way, play. This is about exploration, a game, if you will, almost like a childhood game of hide and seek, where source takes itself, forgets itself as it pours itself out into a plethora of forms who then interact as conscious agents, or as Bernardo Kastrup would phrase it, as alters of source consciousness, ultimately for no reason other than the pure enjoyment of the experience. And of course, that fits very nicely with what I discussed about the revelation for my Christmas Day experience. If this is not ultimately real, if this is just about each of us wearing a new disguise, playing a different character within a new play, ultimately written, my source consciousness, of which we are a fundamental part, then how might that change the very way you look at things and how you live the remainder of your life? And on that note, we've come to the close of another edition of the Point of Convergence podcast. If you'd like to support this podcast, you can do so by going to patreon.com/ExoAcademian or by subscribing on Spotify. But until next time, friends, from deep within the Blue Ridge Mountains of North Carolina, this is ExoAcademian signing out.